Hello. Once again, coronavirus is dominating the news. This time about the South African variant. Pretoria has responded by saying that there's been an overreaction. Um, I personally think we need to really be looking at a way to get some sort of normality back. I appreciate that health services, governments around the world can't be complacent. But I am at the point now where I'm wondering, is there a moral argument to keep locking down, to keep restricting liberty, because there's a chance that people could die from these variants? We may have to get to a point where we accept that this is something that's going to be with us. I mean, the chance of people dying from COVID, much as people die from seasonal flu and so on, because the price constantly putting us on hold and constantly restricting travel and day-to-day life. I think that might be too much to pay. Um, I mean, obviously, someone who's lost loved ones would probably see it very differently, and I have huge compassion for them. And I'm not someone who doubts the science of this, but there are very serious questions on civil liberty. And we cannot have this perpetual situation whereby every time there's a new variant or there's a rise in cases, then we just go back into lockdown. It can't, I don't think that's sustainable. Particularly when there was a lot said about get the vaccine, this will be the way out of lockdown. Most people have been responsible. I'm double jabbed for most people. That having been said, COVID is only part of what I want to talk about here. China. Now, this is something I've spoken about many times, but I believe that China's role in the world is going to be one of the defining issues of the 21st century. So it's never not important enough to talk about. Most recently, the World Health Organization has decided to change two initials of this new variant because they sound apparently similar to Chinese characters, meaning new, and the other one I believe is like Xi, which of course President Xi. The thinking here is, oh, let's not offend the Chinese. So this again points to the hypersensitivity, or rather the walking on eggshells, to use a well-known British expression, um, that international bodies have with Beijing. They're terrified of offending. Another recent example of this is the fact that Hollywood, well, I say a recent example, this is more an ongoing thing. Hollywood will not cast a Chinese villain in a Bond movie. They came kind of close to that in Skyfall, although the villain was a disgruntled former MI6 spy. The backstory was that he'd been tortured in China. Now, that was heavily censored when Skyfall was released in China. But Hollywood hasn't made a film critical of the Chinese state in 20 years, at least not overtly critical. Russia's fair game. There's plenty of films about Russian mobsters and the Russian state, and I've no problem with that, because Putin does run a thug regime, so that's fine. But it could be because Russia doesn't wield anywhere close to the same economic clout that China has. Russia's powerful, it's a major military power, and it can never be underestimated, but it doesn't have the same economic clout, certainly not in Hollywood. So there's this fear in Hollywood that if China's depicted in a bad light in any way, then they will lose a big Chinese audience because it won't be screened in China, or maybe domestic Chinese will turn against it. Um, I've long argued that neo-nationalism is one of the biggest weapons the CCP has. Um, I mean, it is drilled into the Chinese population. This is not to say that Chinese people are subservient ants that just follow everyone else. I've been to the country twice. I know China fairly well. You can never know China 100%, but I know it fairly well, and I've seen that nationalism. And I've seen even intelligent, reasonable people get defensive when it comes to the CCP. And they will say, we're not pro CCP, we don't agree with everything they do. But they will still get defensive when foreigners are saying something about it. And this is the power of nationalism in China. It's not totally unique. To an extent, this is happening in India as well. Under Narendra Modi, there's a sort of Hindutva Hindutva, excuse me, nationalism, whereby Indians have to prove their patriotism, and Christian and Muslim and atheist Indians, if they're not patriotic enough, they're particularly targeted, and it's a bit hysterical. So India really needs to get a grip on that if it wants to call itself the world's biggest democracy, um, because it is often manifested in violence. But what's happening in China? Um, Earlier this month, there was a draft at the I forget the formal term now, but the People's Congress in Beijing, that basically was 12,000 words draft, that basic praised Xi Jinping. Now, this sort of individual personality cult hasn't been seen since Mao Zedong, because basically what you have with China, up until this era, up until Xi Jinping, it's kind of been a collective dictatorship. So there wasn't really a personality cult around Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin or Deng Xiaoping. They were dictators, but they were sort of dictators at the head of a collective dictatorship. And they didn't have the same personal power that Xi Jinping does. I'm even putting Xi Jinping ahead of Deng Xiaoping, who was a very significant figure. It was Deng Xiaoping who opened China up to the world. Deng Xiaoping, I would say, is an interesting historic figure because, on one hand, he presided over the Tiananmen Square crackdown. He was a ruthless dictator. On the other hand, he opened China up to the world, which was certainly at the time a positive thing. Um, but this collective dictatorship has been the way that the CCP has operated because they wanted to avoid the chaos of a cultural revolution. One of the great paradoxes of Chinese history is some of the main victims of the Cultural Revolution were communists within the system. I mean, this is why perhaps it gets less scrutiny than the Nazis, because the Nazis were persecuting others. Often in communist states, it was kind of a, dare I say, cannibalistic system whereby it was sort of a cycle of persecution. It's a bit like in the French Revolution, Robespierre, the Reign of Terror. Robespierre ended up losing his head. Well, in communist states, it was the same in Stalin's gulags. You had people who were diehard communists who then found themselves denounced further down the line. That's kind of what modern Chinese history has been like. After Mao died, some of those who had been sort of denounced by the party were reinstated. Deng Xiaoping was one of them. Xi Jinping himself, as a young man, as a teenager, was part of the Back to the Countryside campaign, I believe it was called, which was kind of bringing urban youths to the countryside to see how the peasants lived. Um, One thing about Mao was, I mean, he was a ruthless tyrant and arguably the biggest killer of the 20th century, but he was a bit like Stalin. He was not a sophisticated character. He was from quite humble origins, not full peasant, but um, I don't think Chairman Mao would have been able to take the same approach that she has. I think she is smarter in terms of being assertive with the modern world. I think Mao probably would have just lashed out. I'm not sure Mao could have handled a hybrid system that China currently has. I mean, with Chairman Mao, there was incredible power there, but China was quite a weak country. It didn't have a major military. It wasn't a major economic power when Mao died in 1976. His apologists often say he lifted millions out of poverty, but at what price? Up to 70 million dead. Absolutely devastating policies like the Great Leap Forward, which caused the most devastating famine in human history. Um, I mean, it's impossible to vilify Mao because his record does such a good job of doing that itself. And even in China, the Communist Party is kind of has a nuanced approach. They officially praise him, but behind the scenes they're kind of embarrassed by his record. So it's important to understand how she got into power and the sort of thinking that the Communist Party has with Xi Jinping. Um, because he's youngish by communist standards. He's about 65 now. So when he got into power, he was part of a generation that didn't really grow up during the Chinese Civil War. So he wasn't part of that military generation, the World War II generation. He was a bit younger. So for a very brief period in 2013, there was some optimism on the outside that Xi Jinping would be a sort of Gorbachev figure, a sort of reformer. Unfortunately, the exact opposite has happened. He's got more tyrannical, more authoritarian, and more assertive. But what I want to touch on here is that I think the rest of the world has this idea that we cannot stand up to China. They're just too powerful. We rely on them too much. Well, from what I see, Beijing's going to lash out no matter what. I mean, no matter what approach the West takes, they're going to feign this victimhood narrative. Oh, you see this from Chinese netizens. The West is jealous of China's success. That's why they're criticizing us on human rights. We're jealous of their success, apparently. Um, and this kind of feeds into history because there was a century of humiliation when China was exploited under the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was corrupt and, it was weak in the face of Western colonialist powers and Japan. And the Chinese have a long memory. They forget the crimes of the Communist Party, but they remember what European powers done. It was a period of humiliation. There's no escaping that. It was also over 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago now. Um, so they look at that, and that's why I think today the nationalism is so strong. Even from people who might criticize the CCP, they still want to show that they're patriotic, and it's kind of understandable because China is a great country. If I was Chinese, I'd probably feel patriotic. But what patriotic Chinese need to understand is this approach China is taking will only backfire in the long run. China cannot go it alone. And this arrogance, this pride, at some point, this is going to backfire. It works now with small Pacific nations and African countries and other countries that are relying on the Belt and Road Initiative. But sooner or later, the world is going to get fed up with China. And by the world, I'm not just talking about Western democracies and Japan and Taiwan. I'm talking about smaller countries as well. I mean, there's already been tensions in Africa between Chinese workers and local Africans over Chinese projects from cultural misunderstandings and various things. Because China thinks it can simply buy up the world. Okay, we'll install a dam here and that'll keep them on side. And this might work short term because then when it comes to the UN, when it comes to a resolution, for example, to condemn the persecution of the Uyghurs, smaller African countries that are reliant on China, they will either abstain or they'll vote in favor of China. Not because they really believe it, because they don't want to upset Beijing. So, my message to those African countries is you talk about not wanting European powers because of the history of colonialism, but what do you think China's doing? You know? Um, is it really any different? So I'm not anti-Chinese. I don't think that a country of 1.4 billion people can be ignored. And I really take no pleasure from the current situation. I have a lot of affection for China. A lot of my happiest memories were in China. But I loathe the regime that runs it. Um, not just its cruelty, but also its extreme nationalism and the arrogance, and this idea that we'll play the victim when it suits us, but then we'll lash out and make thuggish threats when it suits. I mean, this is a dangerous situation. Where's the moderation? Where's the middle ground? An example of this is when Australia called for an independent COVID inquiry. Australia didn't even accuse China of anything. So how did China respond? By an aggressive threat to boycott Australian wine, by stoking up students on Australian campuses. This is the nature of the CCP. But I do think that some cracks are starting to appear. The fact they're lashing out more might demonstrate confidence, but it might also demonstrate nerves. Because in the Hu Jintao era, the authoritarianism was certainly there. The nationalism was starting to rise, but there was still a sort of veneer of politeness, of diplomacy. Now, the so-called wolf warrior diplomats, they don't even try to be polite. They don't even try to hide the hostility. You get state mouthpieces like Global Times that lash out. And sometimes I think it's very easy, and I've been there, to look at China and just feel despair. Like this is this giant monolith that can't be stopped. It's just pushing its way around the world and doing what it pleases. That's true to an extent, but only to an extent. China actually still has some weaknesses. It lags well behind the United States in military prowess and in the economic clout. Um, I get that a lot of people think Biden's weak. I don't think he's that weak, actually. I think he's made some positive moves regarding China. I think he's taken some bold steps. And yeah, so did Donald Trump reaching out to Taiwan. But the those in American politics who are very wary about China, simply bashing President Biden is not going to produce results. When Biden's getting it right, you need to support him. Put partisan politics to the side because this whole Republican Democrat culture war thing, Beijing laps that up. So does Moscow. So, for example, this summit that Biden's called for democratic countries, he's invited Taiwan. Beijing's kicked up a tantrum. Well, does that not show that Biden's standing up to Beijing? Give credit where credit's due. Um, because this is beyond party politics. This is a very critical point in world history. China surpasses the United States in economic clout, if not military. That has grave consequences because it means that they can then control the internet. It means that a lot of things can happen that's really could affect all of us. So, of course, the more that there is pushback against China, the more aggressive the nationalism will become. Well, unfortunately, I don't really see any way around that because there's two approaches. We either stand up to this vile regime, or we take an approach of doing it softly, doing it softly. That's been tried. David Cameron and George Osborne tried that approach under this kind of idea. Well, if we kind of try to be diplomatic and try not to offend the Chinese and just go softly, softly, then they might reform naturally, and they'll be easier to work with. But what's happened? China's just got more assertive. It's been dishonest about COVID. It's completely lacked transparency. It's lashed out. It's spread conspiracy theories. Hasn't worked with international bodies. So the approach, and this has also been favoured by countries like Germany and Italy, of let's just do it softly, softly. Let's not offend Beijing. It's not working. Angela Merkel's leaving office very soon as German Chancellor, and I might make a review about her chancellorship, but I would say that was one of her weak points, not being assertive enough on China. Yes, she's spoken up on human rights issues, but there's also too much of a reluctance from Berlin and Rome and a few other states to not stand up to Beijing. What China needs to understand is the world is not out to get China, but free countries are not going to tolerate being pushed around. Maybe some of them are tolerating it too much. But if China thinks it can continue behaving in this aggressive way, doing as it pleases, playing the victim, and I say this to any Chinese person watching, it's just going to backfire. And you might feel we've got the power right now, but no regime in history has been able to go it alone. And China, I would argue, doesn't really have any true friends. Pakistan, well, that's just geopolitical, as a bulwark against India. I don't believe there's genuine friendship there, not of the sort that you would get, for example, between Britain and Canada. Um, I think that's just geopolitical. And all it takes is a misunderstanding. Say, a senior Chinese official is accused of blasphemy in Pakistan, then that'll just shatter. So I think that'll be short term. I don't wish any ill will against either country, but this path that China's going on, of thinking it could just throw its weight around and play the victim when it suits, it's going to backfire. And yes, China can have its pride. Next year's the Winter Olympics. No doubt there'll be a massive propaganda campaign at that time. Thankfully, there won't be a repeat of 2008. We won't see an international torture day because the pandemic will likely still be going on then. I do think there should be a diplomatic boycott, not a sporting boycott because it wouldn't be fair on the athletes, but a diplomatic boycott. I don't think there should be any British political representation to snub Beijing, to send out the message. You're not going to be treated as a normal partner so long as you behave this way. All in all, I'm sick of the arrogance of the CCP, but I'm also wary of the power of nationalism that it's using. Um, History will determine what happens here. I can understand small Pacific nations being wary about upsetting Beijing. What I think is less understandable is Western institutions, for example, universities that kowtow to Beijing to get their money. I think that's unforgivable, and I think history will judge them badly. I'm not talking about Chinese culture. I'm not talking about, for example, people to people relationships, mixed couples, for example, or even Chinese students studying in the West. Although I do think they're being used by Beijing. I think sometimes I've mentioned this before because I think there's tangible evidence for it. That sometimes nationalism is stoked up and then they bully peers. I think that should be intolerable. I think those students should be threatened with expulsion. Um, but broadly speaking, we need to stand up to Beijing without giving them ammo that we're victimizing China as a country, and that isn't easy. They'll probably say that anyway, but we have to put our values first. And I do think this country's done more than some, but I think there's more we can do. I think Boris Johnson, although he's been a bit more assertive than Cameron was, and May was, I think Johnson still flip flops a bit on China. Um, Liz Truss have more confidence in. I think she is quite hard line with Beijing, and that's good. That's what I want to see in a foreign secretary. But time will tell. One thing's for sure, though, we must not tolerate Chinese bullying. If any of our nationals or our diplomats are pushed around, we need to take a hard line.